everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. How is everyone doing? I am recording this intro from Naomi and we have a new house, and we just moved. Took last week off for the move, and the move itself went very well. I created a manifest. I learned that I should do this after a bunch of stuff went missing when we moved from our first apartment to our second apartment, and I created a manifest. The move went smoothly. Then we went back to just get some odds and ends, and realized that there was just rooms full of stuff that we just neglected to pack up. That were like, oh, that's things under every sink, and the fridge, and all the cooking stuff, and all the just 6 car trips worth of stuff, plus another car trip to Goodwill to give away a bunch of stuff. It was completely. We came back. We were so happy that the move went well. We went back to the apartment to get these things, and then realized how much was left, and we're just utterly, completely demoralized. Which, of course, seems to be the vibe for 2024 anyway, being demoralized. We're a few days out from the election when I'm recording this intro, and I don't know about you, but it's been a viscerally nauseating year, both domestically and abroad. And I don't know how you guys are feeling. Y'all are feeling, but I'm not exactly hopeful. I'd like to be. I don't know. Look, I won't go into it here in this intro. I want to keep this as tight as possible, even though I've been rambling for a little bit. I do, of course, have a free Substack where I write about these kinds of things just a couple times a year. When I have the bandwidth to write an essay, slowdystopia.substack.com. theslowdystopia.substack.com. But yeah, over the last few years, as things have gotten kind of dark, to say the least, one of the themes of this show is, should I, or as I ask my guests sometimes, should we be making art, or should we be doing, I don't know what, organizing, whatever that means. Whatever that means for me. Look, I mean, history is forcing choices upon us, and I'm middle-aged. I've made comedy and podcasting my career at this point, for over a decade. So the question I pose to myself, to my guests, has age narrowed my horizon of possibility? So that even if things get super, super fashy here in America, I still got to spend my days trying to sell TV shows? I mean, I don't know how to work a gun or explosives. I'm nervous about having a gas hookup for the dryer. What, I gotta learn about gunpowder or something? Like, are there gonna be honest-to-goodness concentration camps dotting the purple mountain majesties of our country? And I'm on a Zoom pitch meeting going, it's like it's a sitcom. It's like Friends, but they're all incontinent or whatever. I don't know. I woke up this morning with a vision in my head of Tony Hinchcliffe as a concentration camp commandant, and can you hear Squeak purring? he seems to be living a pretty good life. But yeah, I've woken up with better thoughts in my head. Anyway, this show in the last 4 years has really revolved around existential choices, and today is no exception. Yes, folks, I am talking to Jenny Toomey and Kristen Thompson of the band Tsunami. If you don't know who that is, I'm going to read you their bio right now. Tsunami formed in Arlington, Virginia in late 1990 when Jenny Toomey and Kristen Thompson were housemates at Arlington, Virginia's legendary punk activist Positive Force House. We talk a lot about that. Over the next 7 years, Tsunami wrote and recorded prolifically, releasing 3 full-length albums, Deep End, The Heart's Tremolo, and A Brilliant Mistake, and over a dozen 7-inch singles and EPs, most on their own Simple Machines label. And next week, Numero Group will release Loud As Is, a 5 LP box set reissue of their entire catalog. And buddy, you better believe it's great. Tsunami was a band I found at the radio station, like a lot of my guests on this show. at the radio station at the University of Pittsburgh, WPTS 92.1 FM. And I say it in this episode, and I was not exaggerating, but, Simple Machines, Discord, Teen Beat, a lot of these DC record labels and the musicians behind them really influenced me, both obviously creatively, but I think in a business sense, where maybe to my detriment here in Hollywood, where it is full of psychopaths, where the only thing that is important is how much the Bafo BO, how much money something makes. But really, it was about, how can you be self-sustaining? How can you be a self-sustaining artist? And we talk a lot about that. This is a really good conversation. I don't know if we exactly vibed on the same wavelength, but Jenny and Kristen were definitely game to follow my line of discussion. And we talked about a lot of interesting things about ethics and politics and music in the DC scene in the early 90s and a ton of other stuff. I was very excited to talk to Jenny and Kristen, so I hope you enjoy this episode. All right, I've been rambling for too long. I will just say, coming up on the show, Fred Thomas. His new album is incredible. We had just a lovely talk. Brian Ennell's Infinity Knives is coming up too. Maybe one of my favorite, their album from last year is maybe one of my favorite hip-hop albums of the last couple years. So stay tuned for those episodes. But for now, let's talk to Jenny and Kristen. I do find it interesting. I think both of you started out with a political bend prior to Tsunami, prior to bands. There was some political bend, and it started. I don't know why. I don't know what happened in 2020, but it started to make me think about how much music has pushed me. I'm pretty far left. How the music I listened to when I was a kid, starting with, I don't know, a lot of hardcore. I mean, the hardcore had already ended by the time I was born, but like there was a lot of like political stuff, I guess even Rage Against the Machine when I was a kid. And that pushed me in a certain direction more than, and then I find like the literature. And I'm kind of curious, did you grow up with politics?
Absolutely. 100%.
Okay. By the way, do you want to introduce, I've realized there's two people on this, and do you want to introduce yourselves very quickly? And then.
Hi, this is Jenny Toomey. I grew up in Washington, D.C., which is where all the laws are made and enforced in the federal government, plus where every single march and protest is organized, and where every organization that is set up to fight the power has an office. So yes, politics were always a part of growing up in DC for me.
Kristen, where are you from? Colorado? I took a guess.
Actually, Kristen Thompson. I was born in Ottawa, the Canadian version of Washington, D.C., the capital of Canada. My father did work for the Trudeau government, the first Trudeau, Pierre. And by the time I finished college, which I went to in Colorado, I did move to DC mostly because of the politics of DC and the energy and activity and the music that was associated with and group, blossomed out of DC.
What did your dad do in the government exactly?
My father, David Thompson, was part of the Trudeau sort of advance team. There was a small group of fellas that worked for Trudeau. He was part of the Western desk. Sort of his purview was the provinces, Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia.
What did that mean exactly?
It was a very active time in Canada. There was a separatist movement going on in Quebec. There was a lot of need to reach out to communities. My dad was mostly part of the effort to organize events so that Trudeau would be able to go and address communities and deal with emerging conflicts.
Jenny, besides growing up in D.C., did your parents work in government?
No, my dad was a lawyer, and my mom has had many jobs. In her later life, she worked for the Brookings Institute, which is a think tank, and she then went on to run a bunch of nonprofits that worked on all different kinds of issues. The last one was the American Lung Association.
You're both around the same age, born in the late 60s?
Yes.
68. Yep.
Yep. I'm like, I have like 7 months on her.
Okay. Okay. So, I mean, a tumultuous year. Obviously, you don't remember it as you are. Well, I don't know if it's tumultuous in Canada, but certainly in America it is. But you grow up, I mean, I assume that DC in the 70s, Watergate and everything that came after it, it's still kind of, I don't know, when you were a kid, Jenny, what was the vibe in DC?
Well, my grandparents couldn't come to DC for my christening because Martin Luther King had just been shot and there were riots. So that is part of the origin story of my life. My dad and I have been working on a book, like just telling his stories. And I read this whole incredible story about how it took him like 6 hours to get home because he was a U.S. attorney at that time. And just finding a pathway to get from the U.S. attorney's office, which is just downtown, to Georgetown, which is just, I mean, you could probably walk it in 15 minutes, but just, all of the streets were locked down because of the incredible sadness and rage when Martin Luther King was shot. That I remember watching the Watergate hearings. I also remember when I was at Georgetown, I had a job the summer of the Iran-Contra hearings and sitting in the little booth that I was like a parking person and a little parking attendant. And I had one of those oversized, like it looks like the size of a large microwave now, but it was a TV. And I watched all the Iran-Contra hearings. So, I mean, it was just the water we all swam in. It's always amazing to me when you go other places because, like, I went on a tour right after 9/11, and it was amazing the further we got away from the East Coast, from New York and Washington, the less it seemed like anything had happened to other parts of the country. But it was so immediate, it was so immediate if you were living in D.C. So,
yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, my wife's from New York. It was like... I laughed because I couldn't even come up with a pat phrase to discuss the trauma. It feels DC. I don't know if Ottawa feels like this. DC from the outside feels demonic in a certain way. And I'm, especially I think growing up in the age of Watergate and the age of kind of the, I would say, clumsy government corruption. Did it feel like that? Did it feel pervasive, or was it just like, well, this is just relegated to the Nixon administration or the Ford administration, and it's not the city doesn't have this feeling?
No, I mean, it's funny when you live in DC, you don't just see one flavor of it. There is a lot more politics here because politics is, it's a company town, and the company is the government, the federal government, and everything that comes around it. So that steeps into things. And I think that's great because you get to see democracy in action, and it's not some sort of totally extraneous thing. You see it. When you talk about Watergate, I'm not a historian, I think maybe I took one political class in college. So I'm not an expert, but what I would say personally about it is it seems pretty interesting to have a country where someone is a president, is caught trying to game the system to get reelected, and is removed from office because that is an illegal behavior. So I don't think of it as demonic. I think, the practice of constraining human behavior is an ongoing challenge, and coming to consensus about what we value and what the rules are and how to enforce them is going to be a process that exists forever while humans exist on the planet, if they continue to exist on the planet. So for me, I don't think of it as demonic at all. In some ways, I feel like it really made me feel a lot more like I had a role to play. Like I felt more permission or more agency to really engage large questions because the people who were raising those questions were all around us in Washington, D.C.
Interesting.
That said, DC is not just politics. Like, it's an incredibly rich cultural city. It was really interesting to grow up after the riots because so much of downtown was abandoned, which meant became full of, it was a real mix of incredible wealth, incredible poverty, incredible destruction, incredible, crime, and incredible creativity. So it was a really spectacular place, I think, to grow up, to get a sense of, you're not in a kind of like an insulated pocket, isolated from the rest of the world, but you're also not feeling so decimated that you don't feel like there are places where you can have agency. So it was a really, I wish everyone could grow up in DC in the 70s and 80s. That's what I would say.
Kristen, what about Ottawa?
Well, I was not there long enough. I'm going to actually tell a different story, which is when I came to DC after college, my job, if you will, it was actually a post-college internship, and I worked at the National Organization for Women, which is a big advocacy group, and at the time in the early 90s had its own power in the feminist and women's rights ecosystem. And while I was there, I worked on 2 enormous public demonstrations and marches. Like, they were so big. And to Jenny's point, that, if you had an idea, we could get the proper permits from the Park Service. We started organizing, drawing up plans, who was going to speak, what was going to be on the banners, inviting hundreds and thousands of people to come to DC, and it worked. And, it didn't have it's not like it went off. It wasn't flawless. And I'm not even sure it was even, it does have a lasting impact, because I can remember how powerful you felt when you got so many people together to speak about women's rights, abortion rights. And at the time, it was a real demonstration of public sentiment, pre-internet, basically, that it was like quite amazing to be part of those things. And so I always considered DC as the locus of those kinds of very large demonstrations that have had the power to change public opinion and actually move legislation and policy forward in some cases. So for me, it also means that too.
Yeah. I think maybe being born in the late 60s, you both got to see government function in a way that I have not really in my lifetime. And so I think you have, I'm a product of the Reagan era, where I forget who it is. It's one of the conservative folks in that orbit who was like, we're trying to make government so small we can drown it in the bathtub. And so I wonder if you grew up, it seems both of you are not just hopeful, but also very much like, well, here's the rules, and the rules actually work. And I'm curious if that's an accurate depiction of your beliefs or not.
So, I think the rules can work. And I think, you may have grown up in a moment of the Reagan era. And in the Reagan era, he left, there was the AIDS crisis, and thousands of very young, I'm sorry, those are my dogs, who are they're very vigilant right now. They feel very strongly about the Reagan era. But yeah, no, that, yes, there was a time, and now we think about that, the period afterwards, the work of ACT UP to get drugs made available through a faster testing process to save lives. And we see that there are all sorts of treatments for HIV, not evenly shared across the planet. But also, I have lots of gay friends who are married now. That was, I had gay friends who couldn't even say they were gay out loud when I was in high school. And so I worry about this sense that somehow we are living in a total downward spiral. I understand why it feels like that at this moment, because I think with the internet, we get exposed to so much information all the time, and the kinds of information that is sticky, is the kind that makes us anxious, that makes us feel bad. And I think people are also taking advantage of the internet environment to do all sorts of terrible things, which we can see now. But I also see all sorts of incredibly inspiring initiatives to push back. And again, like I was saying before, like none of this stuff is like a forward march. It is a back and forth struggle to ensure like equality and democracy and freedom, and it's imperfect. I'm not saying it's that I don't feel frustrated about what we're experiencing right now, but I would also say that just because you grew up in the Reagan era doesn't mean that you haven't experienced incredibly powerful, positive initiatives that were brought forth by people who fought for gay rights, trans rights, for access to the internet, for all sorts of incredible things that they were able to accomplish. And I think the more we just think about how it's all a failure, the less likely it is that we engage and feel like we can win things. So I don't know, Kristen, what do you think?
Yeah, I think we're currently in an election cycle, and there's obviously the media tries to talk about it as the candidates are like we're electing particular people, but it's not the candidates that are important. It's like the administration that they represent, that they will staff, the agencies that will have leadership, that have ideas or terrible ideas, that going forward, whether they are eager to drive forward with progress or if they're willing to blow it up.
I guess what I was like trying to angle at was when you were growing up, were you good students? Did you believe in the system? Were you, like this is the rules are there for a reason and they are helpful?
Not all rules. I mean, I think I was an okay student and I broke rules a lot, or I made new rules or new opportunities in relation to rules at times. I mean, I think punk rock is very much about making new rules and standing up for what you believe in. And sometimes that means breaking rules. Like I almost didn't graduate from Georgetown because I engaged in civil disobedience and got caught when the local, the college newspaper had an April Fool's edition where they outed gay professors using pseudonyms for the people who wrote the articles. And so we were protesting this, and they wouldn't publish our op-ed, condemning what they had done. So a bunch of students stole the free newspapers and put down our op-ed. And it took them 8 months, but they found us. And then we had a big conversation at the university level about whether or not our school funds should be used to allow people to anonymously call people names in newspapers.
Sure.
So yeah, I mean, I think I don't think I just think just because it's a rule that it's good. I think I have my own ethical sense and values framework, but I do believe that I'm not an anarchist. I don't think we should get rid of all the rules. I think we need to actually negotiate better rules that actually hold the values that we believe in.
How did your parents react to that, to when you almost got kicked out or almost didn't graduate?
Well, it's funny because my dad found out about it because they were friends with a priest that was a professor at the university. And he said, "Oh, are you worried about what's happening to Jenny?" And he's like, "What's happening to Jenny?" So he told me he didn't love that we took the newspaper because of freedom of expression issues, of freedom of speech issues, but he also knew that it was a free newspaper. So he represented us against the government or the administration, and basically said, was there a sign that said you can only take one newspaper? Because if there wasn't, then you can't steal it. And then they negotiated that we all had to do some civil, some community service, which we were all doing already. So it wasn't a big deal. But it was really interesting, too, because they just assumed that we were outliers. And what they found out is when it all was revealed, there was this huge public conversation about how many people found, what they did with that newspaper to be really distasteful, and how it really sort of showed the fault lines between, the haves and have-nots at that university. But yeah, so yeah, that's just an example of rules and whether you need to follow them.
Yes. Kristen, what about you? Rebellious, not?
Not rebellious, classic good student that always turned their work in on time and things like that. But I did enjoy my work, and my undergraduate degree was in sociology, which I really, really liked. And so the whole thing about thinking about, class structure was fascinating to me. So I enjoyed it all. But, as Jenny said, there was a lot of moments where you were listening to punk rock music or going to shows or setting up shows or participating in marches or being part of the feminist collective, where you're also, reading texts or thinking about structures and how sometimes, especially as, when you're in college, you're like, I can't believe that there are nefarious actors that built the structure this way. And so you're awakening as a person who thinks about how structures are built to disenfranchise people or to oppress people. You start to think about it like, what could I do to fix those things? And sometimes it's through punk rock, and sometimes it's through your career choices. I've worked in either sort of small business, meaning Simple Machines Records, or in advocacy groups like the National Organization for Women, or all the way to what I do now with Media Democracy Fund. So I've been in mostly the sort of sort of civil society sector for most of my working career. So I think that I'm trying to make change and drive towards progress on a daily basis. And it's because of what you learn when you're a college student and you start to think about how sometimes structures aren't well built and they could be better.
Mm-hmm. Did you guys get along with your parents when you were growing up?
Oh, yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I did.
I did too. My parents were, because they were Canadian citizens, when they lived in the United States, they weren't allowed to vote, but they were always very engaged in sort of progressive politics, a liberal party in Canada. So when they moved back to Canada, they continued to be sort of aware of what was going on in Canada. And so we always sort of had aligned values about politics and government, even though they were sort of different versions of it. So
when and why did they move to the U.S.?
Oh, it was my father's work, his career. He needed to, we moved back and forth between Canada and the States when I was growing up, because it was a sort of a post-government job. It was like some property management, like sort of big office towers and stuff like that built in various cities. So there was a need to move back and forth. So yes, that's what we did.
Was that disruptive?
At some point, you stop worrying about it when you're 10 years old and you just go with it. So we moved every 2 years until I was in high school, which you got used to. It was fine. At some point, I was probably quite upset, but I don't remember. Just went back and forth across the border.
Well, no, I think that's your disposition, or that speaks to your disposition, because that would annoy me. I think if I was growing up like that, constantly moving, I think I would bristle. I think it would cause some kind of friction between me and my parents.
The one benefit was that when I went to college, the same week I went down to Colorado Springs to go to school, they moved to Toronto. So we were both like, zoink. And which is fine. I didn't hold it against them. It was like, okay, see ya. So it kind of made you independent, You're sort of doing things. You learn how to, navigate the world and be unafraid to go out and travel or go out on tour, things like that. So
I will say it was fine is the same way that I say it when I don't actually mean it. When I'm like,
oh no, I totally mean it. I was fine with it. Totally fine with it. So
yeah. So what are your parents like as people when you're growing up? Or I still, even in adulthood, see my parents as authority figures and are at a distance to me even now. I am in middle age. And I've never gotten over that. Were you friends with your parents? Were they authority figures? Have they always been authority figures in your life?
I don't think of them as friends. They definitely felt like parents. I loved them a lot. I still love them. And I think one of the things from our generation was that, like, we weren't friends with our parents the way that I think younger generations try to be friends with their children. You know, there was that divide, and there was also like a real excitement about, like, okay, now I'm going to college and I'm off and out into the world and off into my next life. So, yeah, I mean, they were funny and supportive and nice. They still are very supportive. And I'm close to them, but they definitely feel like parents and not friends.
What about you, Kristen?
Yeah, my dad, because of his job, traveled almost every week. So he was on the road all the time, and but that was fine. He would be home on the weekends. I would say he was a very driven person. He passed away in 2020, but very driven, very type A. But the thing is, we had only kind of two rules, maybe three. They were only, well, no, there were four. There was advice. Like, say you were like, there was never any curfews or any rules about how you operated in the world as a young person. They were just say, just use your best judgment. I mean, that was the catchphrase. I'm going out. Use your best judgment. Okay, there was that. He said, I don't care what you do in the world, just don't join the army and don't smoke. So those two rules were often repeated to us. And then the other one was, if we were traveling, if it doesn't fit under the seat, it's not going. So we had this rule about like just being very austere in how we operated in the world too. So those were the ones I remember from growing up. But they weren't disciplinarians. They weren't really coddling. They gave us a lot of latitude, and they were expected that we would use our best judgment to not, let them down, basically.
Did your parents have expectations for you, either verbal or nonverbal?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably where both Kristen and I had a little bit of a conflict because being a professional punk rocker didn't look like being a professional attorney or whatever. But it's funny, it was never that strong, and I never felt a big push around that stuff. And ultimately I get nothing but support from them now in the choices that I've made. But, also, I was the first in my family. Are you first, Crystal? I don't even know. Are you older than your sister, or is your sister older than you?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think with the first ones also, it's a little harder sometimes, they're more worried about, they haven't seen the first step before it gets to you. And they were Catholic too. So there was a little bit of that around the boys in the early days. But for the most part, again, that thing I mentioned before about not being friends and the sort of you're grown up and now you're off into your life was very helpful in those moments, where you got a sense they'd rather you be taking a more traditional path, but ultimately it was your life. So
did you feel, even though you said it was a light pressure at most, did it ever affect any of your decisions, your existential decisions, or your thoughts about which way to move in life?
I don't know if this was a reflection of my parents or even Jenny's, but like when we were running in the 90s, besides being in the band Tsunami, we were also running a record label called Simple Machines. And Simple Machines was very active. And we were one of the bands on the label. We had many other bands that we were helping and had some responsibility for. And so it became clear by like 1997 that it was going to be hard for us to do both well. That can we be in the band, one of the sort of tentpole bands, and also put out good records, tour a lot, and also run the label. And I don't know if it's a reflection of just what you learn from your parents, but at some point we decided like maybe this is where we say this is when it ends, and that we actually take control of what happens with Simple Machines, because we don't want to go into enormous debt. We don't want to let people down. We don't want to overpromise. we don't want to sell it to somebody else. So I think it might be probably just a reflection of what we've learned over time from our parents and from navigating the world and having other peers around us that had set good examples about how they ran their labels or their businesses. But, we were trying to be responsible, I think, and that, we did end up deciding to shut the label down. So
for me, that my dad always wanted to be a lawyer and really loved it. So he worked incredibly hard. And still, like, he only retired, I think he's 82 now, and he just retired like 2 years ago. And so I think I took that, which is like, it's really fun to work incredibly hard on something that you really like. And so I don't think aside from a sort of sad little window between closing Simple Machines and figuring out, starting the future, getting to the Washington Post and starting the Future Music stuff, where I had to do like terrible jobs, filing, I don't know, 50,000 hanging folders that had 3 different pieces of paper in them and having to put those 3 papers in chronological order and the 50,000 photos, like terrible, terrible jobs like that. Aside from that, I've only had jobs that were really interesting and I really, really loved. And I would actually take an interesting job and a meaningful job well over a job that was more lucrative, or make my own job, which we've both done several times. So,
yeah. Well, I think you birthed the moral framework around art that I came up in, which was about not selling out, which was about doing things because it was meaningful and not necessarily because it was lucrative, which I really value. And, still even to this day, I'm like, well, my wife's a little more hard-nosed about it, but like, I'm like, well, as long as we have rent and food and utilities and the cats and the dogs can go to the vet, and look, let me tell you, the vet bills are high. They're old animals. They have a lot of problems, heart problems, intestines, all that kind of stuff. So I do make a little exceptions. And also I work in Hollywood, which is impossible not to be part of what I've been calling the demonic energy so far in this interview. But I'm curious, what was the moral framework that you both grew up in? I mean, Jenny, you said you grew up Catholic, but how much of the moral framework of Christianity or Catholicism was instilled in you? And then, Kristen, how much of, whether religious or not, what kind of moral framework did you grow up in?
I mean, for me, I absolutely had a faith when I was young. I'm a lapsed Catholic. I don't think the Catholics have given women anything to work with. and the idea of the moral superiority of the Catholics, considering what they've reaped upon the world, is pretty hard to see. That said, the sort of basic ethical teachings around caring for your neighbors and doing to others as you would have done to you, and the idea that it's easier for
to get a camel through the needle of
a camel to get through the needle of the eye. Exactly. All of that kind of
heaven.
Exactly. I have a lot of those feelings. I think 2 things led me. I mean, so those kinds of basic values and frameworks, not getting into the weeds, because, the minute you get in the weeds, you could be text proofing the good parts of the Bible and the bad parts of the Bible don't exist. And, so putting all that aside, just the larger values, and also the communities of churches that I went to up until when I went to college and stopped going to church, they all did community service. So, we would go and pick up the Ottenberg's bread on Sundays. And that's actually the first thing I did with Positive Force was connect Positive Force to the community service I was already doing with my church, and all the punk rockers would go get the bread on Sunday mornings, and we would bring it to the homeless shelters. And then we would go to church and we would use the exact same bread we'd brought for the host for the ceremonies in church. So that was just very foundational to me. But I think punk was even punk's what, solidified it. And as well as privilege. I didn't grow up in an environment of enormous wealth. My parents were like first ones in their families to have college degrees. They worked hard for what they got. But I lived in a safe neighborhood, and I could go to college, and I didn't, I wasn't hungry, and I was supportive. So that gives you a lot of headroom to imagine values and ideals. And so I had that. And then punk rock helped. The combination of Positive Force and punk rock were perfect for me because, as a young high schooler, older people in Positive Force would help me go get those permits that Kristen was talking about. So I could put on a show at DuPont Circle, or I could organize a march or protest or whatever. So from a very young age, I was supported by other individuals in community to engage in activism and community service. And then just seeing how Discord and some of the other labels in DC built their businesses around these kinds of ethical frameworks, I don't think they were fool's errands. They'll pay no more than $5, or we'll only do benefit shows when we're in DC, the kind of Fugazi commitment to that. These kinds of things I thought were incredible because you really feel viscerally that you are, committing some aspect of your life towards doing something very good. I think as I got older, I began to realize that those are really important things because they model a different kind of imagination of a world you can be in, but they're not sufficient. And that's when we get back to what you were calling the Death Star, or, the devil land of DC, which is that the devil is in the details, and the details are, when a piece of regulation is put in place, how it would be enforced and who will benefit from it and who will not benefit from it, and making sure that, it's not sufficient just to do great works in your own life, that there is also these broader systems that you actually have to spend some portion of your life trying to make more equitable and better for other people.
Just so we're clear, I am not an anarchist or an anti-government lunatic. Just wanted that out there. I was reaching for a word, and that's the one I grabbed and then stuck with it. Just so everyone, so that you're not talking to like some kind of like either QAnon-y person, or I just wanted that out there. So you're just like,
I'd like you to sign this petition that I have here.
I'm
all
right. Kristen, what about you? In terms of ethics, any kind of religion, was any kind of ethical beliefs? Were you what's going on when you're growing up?
Yeah, there was no overt religion. We didn't go to church. I think if I had to describe it in a sort of a sect term, it would be we were sticking to the Protestant work ethic. It was that seeing the value in working hard, sticking with your commitments, honoring the group through doing your part, But we didn't have any religion or any church going in our world, in our family. But still, I think that there was a nice ethical framework through which we were raised, meaning that, expectations about doing good things, doing good work, being honest, being principled, seeking to use what we've had as far as resources go. As Jenny said, I mean, I grew up without wanting a lot, meaning I had food, I had wonderful houses, great schooling, wonderful education. So how can we put that to use in the service of others? So that's kind of how it manifested itself.
When I was growing up, I could really seeing injustice in front of me, even like minor things, because obviously I grew up in the suburbs in Pennsylvania. I mean, you don't know that, but I grew up in the suburbs of Pennsylvania. It's not like I'm witnessing, the worst things in the world on a regular basis, but even minor injustices actually physically bothered me. Like I could feel the nausea in the pit of my stomach. And I'm curious, when you're growing up, are these just, whether it's religious or secular, are these just rules you follow because your parents told you or because the church told you, or do you feel the force? And I ask this because I'm, as a preface to then, like, how does music, because going back to the very beginning of when I was talking, I'm like, I think feeling the force of this stuff when I was a kid, feeling injustice in my gut, and then once music like really grabbed me, and then I'm listening to whatever Fugazi or whatever that's like has a political bend, I think those things started working in concert with each other to push me a certain direction. So that's why I'm asking this question. Jenny, what did it, and is this, does the way I'm describing this, is it familiar to you?
Oh, sure. I'm amazed when people don't feel injustice anymore because they get older, like somehow there's a reason why that person is sleeping outside when I'm sleeping in a house. Like I'll never get over that, or why this woman gets treated a different way than this man does, I suppose you have to temper some of that because it becomes paralyzing, because there is so much inequality in the world. But yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. The growing up in DC where the bands acknowledged inequality and sang about it, and sort of empowered kids to tell their stories in their voices. And in the period that I was coming up in the whole Revolution Summer period, right. And with Positive Force, we're actively engaged in protesting apartheid in South Africa or organizing, all sorts of, organizing against war, or organizing against sexism, organizing to support a woman's right to choose. All of these kinds of things just felt amazing. It just felt amazing that you could, and we lived in community houses where, we embodied certain kinds of values in how we chose to live in those houses. And then putting our own records and putting frameworks around that weren't all just lecturing. They weren't all like, we don't. Right. It was also like, how to make them silly, how to make them beautiful, how to make them funny, how to have, we remembered this when we were doing a conversation, thinking about early days in Simple Machines the other day, where when we had our working holiday event, we had a 3-day festival where all the musicians plus some other ones who gave us songs for the working holiday 7-inch series we did for 1 year, played. And our idea was, well, all these bands are equally good, so we'll just flip a coin at the beginning of the whole thing. And the first, or pull out of a hat the name of the person. And so Jawbox, who's probably the most, one of those famous bands playing, had to play first, but it's just the idea that why do we do it the way, why are we doing it just the way they say we have to do it? We don't have to, So yeah, DC was all about those kinds of permissions. Absolutely. And I think it's what holds my imagination open to this day.
Was it visceral for you too, Kristen, growing up? Even before getting to DC?
Not as much. I think that's why DC was so instantly attractive for me, because you could see where music and activism and action all intersected. We were just mentioning the other day that it was September 22nd of 1991 was the first Positive Force show I went to in DC. I had just moved there 2 weeks prior, and they had seen flyers we pasted all over DuPont Circle where it said Fugazi and Jawbox and Shudder to Think are playing at this church down the street. I'm like, oh, I've heard of a couple of those bands. I've heard of Fugazi, and I knew about them because I'd done college radio. But so I went, and it was a Positive Force show, and as was with Positive Force shows, in addition to the bands playing and it being a benefit for some named beneficiary, there's usually tabling where participants and audience members could learn more about the beneficiaries, sign up for Positive Force things, and also there's usually a moment where Positive Force members talked a bit about why they had decided to organize around this particular issue. And Jenny spoke about the Alexandria,
I think Alexandria, maybe it was Arlandria Tenant Association, something like that. Mm-hmm.
Right. So it was the first time I saw Jenny. She went up and talked about why they had chosen Arlandria, why there were issues on the table in Alexandria, how you could get involved. And I was like, whoa, this is amazing. And so I went back and signed up for Positive Force that night. So I went to the next meeting, and then I ended up, the first action I did with Positive Force was going to the Rolling Stones Steel Wheels tour parking lot outside RFK Stadium to collect bottles and cans from the tailgaters, which we then recycled. So I was delighted to do that because it was like, this is so cool. Like, we can do all these fun things together, organize shows, have meetings, talk about what issues, even how Positive Force ran was a really interesting experiment in group dynamics, decision making, and things like that, which was new to me as well. So DC was where I really saw things start to intersect for me.
How were decisions made? Was it a collective kind of decision making?
I can't remember. I don't think we had to do everything by 100% consensus. But what was nice is like there was probably somebody who wanted to do recycling, because like back then there wasn't recycling. You didn't have recycling in your house. And you had to go get things. You had to bring them to recycling centers. Somebody wanted to do that, and they could say, some of us are going to be doing that. Who wants to come and do that? And then a subset would go do that. There were certain things I think we had to decide as a group around, like if we were going to, as a group, do an interview with someone or something like that. There were some things that required a level of consensus. And we did have rules of engagement in how the meetings were run and other kinds of things, which I can't remember anymore. And when we lived in the house, we had rules about the house and responsibilities in the house. But it very rarely felt constraining because you had a lot of agency. It was more additive than it was restrictive, I felt. And I think a lot of people always felt it was restrictive, like the same way everybody always made fun of straight edge as being like this silly restriction, instead of just imagining how powerful it felt to be underage and able to go to all the shows, because the bands made it a point of only playing places that you could go see shows, So, it was really empowering. I wish there were more organizations like that for kids too, because kids are so much more creative than older folks are. Like older folks just get calcify. And so when you're a young kid, they'll be like, oh, hey, go work for PERG. We need you to get signatures or whatever. And I'm not saying that PERG is bad or that you don't need to get signatures for things, but think of how boring that is in comparison to like organizing your own, like teach-in on suicide or whatever, something that high school kids are feeling really acutely and could really have a lot more, like would have a more of a lasting impact on their lives than just standing outside some store trying to get people to sign their name to something.
Yeah. I was about to say, when did music become something that you wanted to pursue? But also I was just like, art in general, like when was that something that was a force in your life as opposed to either something you just did or something you had to do in school?
So I was in really professional choirs for 3 or 4 years in DC.
Because of the church?
No. And gosh, I'm sorry. I should probably stop. Oh, he's just put it down. Did you hear all the squeaking?
No.
Sorry. My poodle found a very squeaky toy. He's trying to get the other dog to play with him. So when I got up a second ago, it was to move, some things that were about to get eaten. But anyway, so yeah, I was in these professional choirs. We would practice 3 days a week. It was like really eye-opening in a bunch of ways, because it was like kids from like the age of 8 up until like college kids in this. We had practices 3 days a week. So you learned a lot about all sorts of really complex music. So like there was lots of complex classical music. There were like musicals, and then like weird dark songs that we sang that were more secular. So learning to sing together. And then the venues where we practiced were all over the city. So we were in burnt out parts of the, like churches in burnt out parts of the city and more elite parts of the city. And we performed all over the city, like from the White House to like, the sort of most burnt out church. So it was this incredible learning environment. I loved singing. It was great. So I always felt capable, but sexism was so extreme at that moment that women were hardly ever in bands. I mean, really, I was lucky that in the DC scene, the scene was small enough. Like in small scenes, people are much more embracing of diversity. They don't have sufficient numbers to say like, oh, we only go to the hardcore shows and there's sufficient of them to keep us entertained. Like all the different subcultures in DC all had to go to the same venues. And so there was all this cross-pollination that happened. But for me, the reason I started getting into bands, it didn't happen until I was in college. What my best friend Derek was in bands and I was helping him. Like I helped him connect with the folks at Inner Ear to record his band's first record, Carpe Diem. And Derek and I had been best friends for like 4 years. And then in college, I also became really good friends with Dave Grubbs, who went to Georgetown as well. And both of them sort of asked me why I wasn't in bands. Dave in particular had asked that because Louisville was another one of these small scenes where like maybe the most important band was like the Babylon Dance Band and Tara Key played guitar in it. And so like it was women were in a bunch of these bands. And so I just started asking myself, like, why am I not in bands? And so the summer of my sophomore year, I basically told Derek we were going to get in a band. And so we started being in Geek. But yeah, it's hard to remember just how all pervasive the sexism was. It wasn't normalized that women would be in bands, even though there were many examples of women who had been in new wave bands and bands in the DC scene, Sharon Cheslow and Lee Husick and Teak and these different women who had done music. It still wasn't like obvious that you could be in a band. Yeah. I needed to tear down the sexism in my own head to get to even imagine it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I can't even, because even in the late 90s into the early 2000s, the misogyny was still thick. So I can't imagine what it would have been like a decade or so before that or more. If it's still, even when I was getting in college and getting into bands, it was still, you know, like an improv team where most of the bands were 5 white guys and maybe 1 white woman, but like mostly 5 white guys. But Kristen, when you were growing up, when did art or music or any kind of creative activity enter your life as a force, as something that like was compelling to you?
I mean, I was not in choir. I took piano lessons like many people. There was nothing particularly unique about that. I was mostly like, I just liked music. By the high school, I was figuring out what was going on with like British new wave and with SST records in California and what was going on with Sonic Youth or whatever. All those bands I found fascinating. I was really excited to like listen more, learn more, see them if I could, because I was in Denver, so not a lot of them made the trek. So in college, it wasn't that I was playing guitar, but I became the co-chair, I guess, of the concert committee. Mm. So it was an exciting moment to learn more about how bands go on tour and how you get them to come to Colorado Springs. So we did do that successfully. And it was just another, like, what would you call it? It was like just a taste of what's possible. And I got really excited about that stuff. So I was in bands in college, but like I was not really playing guitar or anything. So it wasn't until I moved to DC that and became close friends with Jenny that I went on tour with Geek, the Geek Superchunk Seaweed tour, where I was a driver / whatever I did that on that tour. It was the real merry band of people. And then Tsunami started right after that tour. So I could maybe play 2 guitar chords. And you can tell when you listen to very early Tsunami songs, like I'm using my full repertoire at that point. And then, you know, Tsunami just sort of, it was a moment where I could learn actually how to play more chords and be in a band. And that was where it started. So
but was there a desire to do this that was like Jenny, let me ask this specifically with you. You know,
okay, let me back up before you even get there.
Okay.
The whole reason is that it's really fun. And it's really fun. And And it's a really fun way to get to that intersection, at least for Tsunami, like the intersection between art and small business and making a point through lyrics, expressing your interest, talking about inequity, whatever it is, but also demonstrating that it's possible for a band that is self-sufficient, run by, or at least we were a co-ed band at the point, driving ourselves around, like doing things that were a demonstration of that it was possible too.
Uh-huh. Well, Kristen, let me ask you, was that a conscious decision when you were forming the band? Or was that...
I'd say so.
Okay. Like you talked about it, about like what you want this to embody?
We had a great, with Fugazi, like about 4 blocks away, there was a lot of, they were a good model of how a band can be very, very self-sufficient and have their own rules of engagement. We were not in the same category as them, but there were a lot of things we could ask them about, or see them as an example of how you could operate,
Because I think that intentionality is interesting in a way that, like, when it's until I made Hollywood my career, I didn't have that intentionality. I was kind of just like, oh, this seems like fun, or I like this, or this speaks to me. I'll do this. And only later did I start to be like, well, okay, well, what is that? What do I actually want to do? And how do I want to do it? And what do I want to say? I mean, not that I wasn't saying, well, no, sorry. Even when I wrote lyrics when I was younger, I was emotionally repressed. So everything's buried under 10,000 layers of obscurity because I could not really say what I want to. But it seems like both of you were very direct people. You had thoughts about what you wanted to do and how you wanted to do it. And I find that very interesting. Am I characterizing it correctly?
I mean, I think we learned as we did it. So like I had been in Positive Force for probably 5 years, maybe 6 years by the time Tsunami started, right? So I sort of lived and breathed music. I mean, and that's where you actually really see the sexism, right? That like I was living and breathing music and I also could sing, but I couldn't imagine myself in a band for whatever reason during that whole period. But as you learn more, you do more, right? So learning how to put out the records, like Kristen said, we had all these incredible people around us, and not just like the Discord people, but also the Team B people and the Slumberland people, and
right.
Everybody, lots and lots of people who could help us, the WGNS people, and it was easier back then to make the choice to live an artist's life because we could live in a group house. And with 6 people in the house, the rent could be $200 a month or $300 a month. And with a couple days a week at a minimum wage job, we could have sufficient money to actually pay for the house that we were staying in. And we could also have a basement where we could practice. And there was a lot of it that was just sort of cobbled together. And when you were saying about the direct stuff, I mean, I think if you look at the early Tsunami stuff, like we said in the box set, I can't remember exactly what I had said, but there was a quote in there that says something like, our first songs were about like jokes. They were like, we would write our songs like in 15 minutes about something that had happened that day. And the second songs were more about the scene, about like sort of the power in the scene and criticisms about that and dynamics and sexism and all of that kind of stuff. And the final stuff became really more about us grappling with capitalist structures and the failure, the inability to compete with the larger systems.
Right.
There was the inability to stay the way we wanted to stay, and also avail ourselves with the larger constrained systems of distribution and commercial radio and all of that other stuff, and not wanting to make that trade-off. But like there was a real trajectory from sort of like ideologically feeling like this is about fun to like, now we're going to spill the tea on what we don't like about our scene or the dynamics of this. And then finally, the way that capitalism hammers all of us round pegs into square holes,
Yeah. Did you have a desire when you were younger to do a specific thing? Or was it were your lives both a process of excavating until you figured out what you wanted to do, or finding the things that spoke to you?
I wanted to be a large animal vet, an equine vet for many, many years. Even like as a 10 or 12-year-old, I had studied many parts of horse anatomy, knew how to mix a poultice, whatever.
Wow.
And
you never mixed me a poultice.
Well, you never asked. But then I worked for a large animal vet for a summer as her driver and her I stalked the truck every morning. And I was like, whoa, this is, and I'm not shy of hard work. It was just like, you were gone all day, like 14 hours dealing with emergency after emergency. And knowing how long it takes to get through med school for vets, it was like, I'm not sure this is the path I expected to be. So when I was in college, I picked sociology. And then there were a lot of other opportunities that came out of there. But that was
Is that on a whim?
No. Well, I mean, sociology, interesting. You don't have that class in high school usually, right? Like you don't know that that's a discipline or an academic, conversation at all in high school. So I took like 101, like when I went to the first semester of school, and I just loved the idea of talking about class. And so that's what I picked, like within the first, few sessions of sociology. I'm like, this is my major.
Yeah.
So it was an introduction right in college. So yeah.
Yeah. Did you get to read stuff like Bourdieu and those kind of people?
Oh, I think they were all the classics. I'd have to look. I don't know. I don't remember.
Was there ever a desire to make music, though? Or was it something that once you found it, you're like, oh, okay, this is great?
I was a bit of a theater kid. And that's where I met the punk rockers, actually, because a bunch of them were like stagehands or, doing miking or sound stuff. And I broke my...
Were you doing musicals?
I did musicals, and then I broke my ankle. I was Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. Thank you very much. But I broke my ankle and couldn't be in Grease. And that's when I went deep in punk rock, because like my whole peer group at that point were off doing Grease, and I couldn't be part of it. So I made new punk rock friends instead, and the rest is history.
This is a crazy question that is not answerable, but I'll ask it anyway. If you hadn't broken your ankle, would you have gone in that direction?
I think so.
You think it would have got you anyway?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I mean, there was a bunch of very cool punk rockers that went to my high school, and I think I would have found my way to them eventually.
There were redundancies that it would have taken over at some point.
It's a really big school, so there was like lots of different kinds of cliques. But yeah, I think so. But who knows?
Did you have a desire, though, to make music, or was it something that only like being at part of the scene, and then, like you had said before, kind of having to like push through the sexism of the, like, literally it feel like the way you described it feels to me mentally like it was like a brick wall that you had to kind of just like either smash through or like dismember.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times when people talk about what it takes to get to equity, when communities have been denied access to resources and roles for years, it can seem confusing to people. Like, aren't we all equal? Shouldn't everybody have the same right to everything equally? And my sense is that part of that is, people need, certain roles need to be modeled for people to understand that there's a pathway for them to get into this work. I mean, A lot of the work that I do right now with my job is around trying to bring a different kind of trained technologist, someone who has more of a social justice framework in how they think about technology. So they're not just solving problems in a transactional way with technology, but they're thinking about the ecosystem of technology and how it's changing society. Finding those kinds of technologists and getting them placed in roles in organizations that have a gap in their analysis and understanding about how to use tech or respond to it. And what I find is it's almost impossible to explain to somebody the value of having someone like that in an organization when they haven't had one.
Right.
But that once you've actually made a good match where there's someone who's bringing a completely different lens that's complementary to the work that this organization already knows it wants to do, it shifts the culture completely. And they then get to a place where they can't even imagine not having had that kind of capacity.
Yeah.
But without the modeling of it, it's really hard to imagine. And so when we've lived in societies where we've told whole bunches of people that they, like Catholicism, I'm sorry, women, whatever your skills, you're not intelligent or powerful enough to lead us. Like that. I can't say it more clearly why that religion becomes impossible for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's what I'm trying to, I figure out the nuance of. Was there a desire that was hidden and that you couldn't speak, or could it not even form because of the misogyny? I don't even know if that's answerable, but I think that's the line I'm trying to figure out.
Oh, I'll say that, like, when Fire Party started, I could imagine myself in a band suddenly.
Okay.
You should maybe say who Fire Party was for listeners.
Well, I mean, and for me, Fire Party in particular, because like Kate Samworth went to my high school, Natalie Avery went to my high school, and Amy Pickering was in that choir. She was a couple years older than me, and in that choir, and sort of deeply connected to, like, what went to Wilson, where all of the Discord folks, or Ian and Jeff, went. So they were peers to me in a real way, because like we were sitting in the same humanities class in junior year of high school, but they were also deeply embedded in this scene that was so important to me. And so there was just a bridge once they began playing. And I always say about Fire Party, I've said it 1,000 times, but like, it was amazing to me because so much of the music that's written at that time is about the emotions that you're feeling at that age. And to finally have the girl side of the story in songs, just was completely transformational,
Amazing. Jenny, Kristen, thank you for joining me today. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for having us. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you very much. My dogs, thank you too. Because I thought we had about like 10 more minutes where they weren't going to pee on something.
The number of times, if my wife and I we have to, like, setting up for Mabel, our dog, setting up, like, we play mats, all this other stuff when we record. Otherwise, she will run around licking the floor. She will decide just to pee for the heck of it.
Mm-hmm.
I 100% understand.
Yeah, no, we did it. We did an interview last week, and the first thing my new dog, Iggy, who we just adopted 6 weeks ago, did was walk into the room and, like, within the first question, lifted his leg on the gate. And I was like, okay, what's that behavior? I've never seen that before.
Yep. Very familiar. Very familiar.
Anyway,
thank you both. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope that was okay.
Yeah. How do you feel? Good, bad, neutral?
Great. Great. Yeah. We definitely haven't talked about our parents
ever
for a long time, if ever. Yeah. So that was really cool.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh, bye.